This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the Forging Table. The mission of Undaunted.Life is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. At the Forging Table, you'll see a group of regular guys forging spiritual resilience by digging into God's Word and world walk. I knew it was going to happen. You know what? We're just going to leave it in there. So to our editor, leave it in there. We make mistakes. So we're welcoming all of you to come along on that journey with us. We got the OGs in the house, Ryan and Eric Browning, and you're technically an OG now, Jay, because you've got one of these under your belt. You don't want to leave yet. This isn't like, are you taking notes for later? Like if we get into any type of like church hurt thing or like church, like, you know, are you like taking notes on all three of us?
Yes.
Okay, like perfect. All right. Fantastic.
I'm going to get some church discipline next week.
Yeah. The church discipline is going to come through, and it's going to start with, well, they're violating the first rule of Faith Bible, which is calling it Sunday school as opposed to ABF. Guys, we're just going to keep hitting that drum. So if you don't like it, we're just going to keep hitting it. But in all the kerfuffle of the first episode, I forgot to ask you the first questions that we always ask everybody that is a first timer on the Forging Table. Everyone has to answer the same three questions. So you get 2 minutes total to answer these three questions. Okay.
Wow. Okay.
So how did you become a Christian? Nailed it. There, got timer going. Okay. How did you become a Christian? How do you like to study the Bible? And how does your mind work? Ready, set, go.
Became a Christian through the ministry of Fellowship of Christian Athletes. So was in 9th grade. A guy named Doc Blevins led the FCA ministry at my junior high and high school back in Owasso, Oklahoma. He invested in me, took interest in me, made sure I heard and understood the gospel. It took me about a year to hear it out of his mouth, and then things kind of finally clicked. I realized I was a sinner, needed a Savior. Jesus was the Savior I needed. And extremely grateful for him and that ministry over the years. Second question was how I study the Bible. So, devotionally, I live in the Psalms and Proverbs, so that's my typical morning type reading. Don't necessarily do deep dives, but read those, pray through what I've just read, usually 4 or 5 Psalms and a proverb. Do that on a monthly cycle, so all the way through Psalms and all the way through Proverbs in the span of a month. And that's just healthy from our spiritual life. Start the day, pray through those things. On the study side, usually if I am studying, it's probably more for something to prepare. And so an example of how I do study the Bible is I print off the text, 14-point font.
Boom. There it is.
I'm an older gentleman, a space and a half or double spaced. I go through, I read the text over and over and over and over again. Don't memorize it, but get it in my head. Then I start marking things up, asking questions, looking up words, trying to nail down the trouble spots and understand it in a clearer way.
All right. And how does your brain work? Are you a slow processor, or are you like a, quick thinker, right on your toes? I'm a slower processor. I'm very analytical, so sometimes even bleed into paralysis of analysis. But I would say that I've never been asked that question, and I'm not even quite sure how to answer it. That means you're a slow processor. Okay. And so basically, I was actually curious as you were giving your answer. I was wondering if that leads to your preaching style, because you and Mark both are transcribers. And so it seems like, at the very least, that y'all write out every single word of your sermon and you kind of present it, or that's at least what you do. Whereas I'm way more extemporaneous. I know generally where I'm going, but I will have one word on my notes and then I'll have the word flow next to it. And I can go for 5 minutes on whatever that topic is, because it's just in there. And so every time I say it, it's a little bit different. But it seems like you and Mark are a little bit more like, no, we're going to prepare this and we're going to shoot the arrow and it's going to be the same just about every time. So how did you kind of like end up with that style?
I really value like the economy of language. And if I don't transcribe, if I allowed myself to flow, I would repeat myself a lot and waste a lot of time going back through things I've already said. And so I think it's really important to say things you want to say and say it in the way you want to say it. And my best way to do that is by transcribing. Now, when I transcribe a sermon, I've written it and gone over it and edited it and corrected it and changed it so many times. I don't have it memorized, but I can basically like finish every sentence. So hopefully it doesn't come across as if I'm reading it in a sort of stale way. But I am a transcriber. Mark's not quite a transcriber. The only place I let myself flow is in any sermon I give. Typically, there's a little bracketed section that just says gospel, and I'm going to present a free offer of the gospel. I'm not going to write that out. I'm just going to offer it and tell people to trust in Christ and kind of let that go wherever it needs to go.
Yeah, I will say that if someone were just to listen to one of your sermons, I don't think they're going to be like, oh, this guy is literally just reading. So I think you do a good job of presenting it. It is also interesting that what I find hard is because I'm typically a pretty jovial guy. I like to cut up and get people to laugh, and I'm pretty sarcastic and those types of things. But the more strictures I put on myself, the less I'm able to do that. Like some comedians, they write out everything. And so they're writable funny. For whatever reason, I'm not writable funny. I'm flow funny. And whenever you do flow off of your notes, you can be really funny. And so like that's the other thing. It's usually towards the beginning part of the sermon, but you'll kind of like let yourself get away from your notes for just a little bit. And so I'm like, I wonder, I have thought about doing this. I'm not going to do it, but I have thought about it, about right before you get up there. So like right during the last song, just being like, hey Jay, how you doing? And just jacking your notes and taking off running.
That's a fear. That is a great fear of mine.
There's no way for you to catch me in time. Like you got to get started in the next 7 seconds.
He's got huge calves.
And then what would, I know that's going to weigh him down. That's like, it keeps from the aerodynamics of being able to chase me down. So
the funny thing is it's hilarious. So, Mark has a really good sense of humor. But Mark's not funny. You understand the difference?
Yeah.
So he knows what's funny, but it doesn't just, to use your word, flow out of him. So I'll have people say, oh, you're so funny. And I'm like, well, Mark's jokes are better than mine. And that's because they're so well curated. Like he goes and looks for like the perfect joke for the perfect scenario. So anyway, he has great jokes, but perhaps I'm funnier.
But then he delivers it and then he asks us to laugh. We never.
Yeah, they're dad jokes.
There's never like, can I get an amen? It's always like, you guys gonna laugh at that?
Yeah, it's like Jeb Bush back in the day. It's like, you guys can clap now. It's like, go ahead. So just saying that were to happen, let's say I did jack your notes and then Ryan and Eric stood in between you and me. So there was no chance of you being able to get through that, blocking and tackling to get to me. What would you do in that moment? Cause you can't be like, excuse me, we need to stop that, man. I got to get my notes back. Like, what would you do?
I'd go print off another set, or I'd just get up there and go for it and fall on my face, and the sermon would be about 12 minutes long.
I don't think so. I think it might be something that may be worth trying. I'm saying that I'm not going to be the one to do it, but I might hire someone.
A few years ago, there was this whole preach without notes, no notes trend in pastor circles. And it was just funny to see kind of the guys who were very, very like, I don't know, almost self-righteous about being able to step up there, no notes. Like, this is the way to do it. This is where the Spirit really works. Anyway, I felt quite condemned during that whole season of debate. But I'm a notes guy.
And Kyle does now, too.
But what's funny is, so Philip DeCourcy,
yeah,
who I think has been the biggest influence on Mark's preaching in his entire ministry career. I watched Mark's preaching go from really good to great as he developed this friendship with Philip. Philip's an extremely good preacher, and it's not just because he has that
Irish accent.
Yeah. He's just very skilled at what he does. But he's a transcriber, which I take great comfort in. So.
I will tell you that anytime you have an accent, it adds like 15% to your overall believability and likability. And so like
intelligence.
Yeah. I just take that down. I was like, look, you're not going to fool me with that Irish accent. Get the heck out of here.
Dude, Philip's awesome though. I enjoy Philip's.
He is solid. So again, guys, you should definitely check him out, but we're going to dig in to Acts 18. So Browning, let's go ahead and get right into it here. Yeah. We're not starting with you first this time. We're going to give you a little bit of a break. You have to read the rest of the Bible every time you're on the fortune table. How about that? All right, Browning, go ahead and read the first 11 verses of Acts 18.
Roger. Okay. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you or harm you. For I have many in this city who are my people.
So, and go and read 11 as well.
Oh, and he stayed a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them.
So there's quite a bit here in this first section, but to set the context, I remember when Mark just recently did a sermon this summer, because we kind of did a little small Acts sermon. I thought Mark did a great job of kind of setting the stage for showing that Corinth was kind of the Las Vegas of its day, but it was really an economic powerhouse in this area. So if Athens was the intellectual powerhouse and the intellectual center of this area of the world, then Corinth would have been, one of these in terms from a commercial side. So it was a boom town. It was very wealthy. None of the buildings in this city were more than 100 years old. And so if you look at something, like Philadelphia versus like Abu Dhabi, it's kind of like a little bit of a difference between those two areas. Like, obviously almost every building in Philadelphia is older, whereas something like that is more contemporary. This was the site of the Isthmian Games. So that's where you will hear Paul reference the games and, training and things like that. These were something that happened every other year. These were things that kind of coincided or would have looked like the Olympic Games. And so this is, the capital of the Roman province of Asia. Like this is an incredibly, incredibly important city. But the first thing that I really want to discuss here, and there's really so many huge chunks that we could get into, is, Jay, I don't know if this has happened for you, but it's certainly happened for me. People get really uncomfortable when pastors make money outside of their salary. And so when pastors write books, or when pastors go and speak at conferences, or anything where they earn a speaker fee or an honorarium of any kind, I've had people throw in my face, hey, you should come speak at my event. The one I'm thinking about is there was a group in Alabama that wanted me to come to their 4-day camp, and they wanted me to speak 7 times for 60 minutes each time, and they wanted me to pay my own way. And I remember being like, maybe this was kind of rude, but I'm like, you know what? I think you should walk into your boss's office on Monday and tell him that not only would you like to work overtime, you would no longer like to be paid. And so I feel like in this moment, now again, he's working as a tent maker, so he's kind of working all week and then preaching on the weekends kind of a thing. So preaching was almost like a side hustle or something like that. But it just kind of brings up for me that people forget that Paul worked for money, that Paul wasn't just, always like a pauper with his pockets out and like, oh, people help me with my ministry. But at the same time, this idea that you shouldn't be making money if you're in ministry or ministry adjacent, it really, really bothers me, because it's like everything costs money. If you want to eat food and live indoors, you have to make a living. Some people just happen to make a living doing something that is inside the world of Christianity.
Yeah, you don't muzzle the ox. That's
Yep.
the old metaphor in Scripture. Don't muzzle the ox while he's treading out the grain. I think also where it says that the worker deserves double honor. Like it's interesting that Paul has to, I can't cite chapter and verse, I'm sorry, but another place in his writing, he basically says, hey, some of these guys are in this just to get rich. So there's obviously an opportunity for the pastors, the church leaders, the spiritual authorities to make a good living in this practice. And so I think Paul's also, in his approach, being a tent maker, what we would call, or bivocational, he addresses the Thessalonians this way later on in one of his letters. But he also mentions, like, I didn't take from you. Remember, I worked when I was among you. I wasn't on the take. I wasn't taking advantage of your generosity. Right. I was paying my own way. I was making my own way. And that's what he's doing as he enters into Corinth and finds this couple to partner with.
He didn't get anybody to buy him a jet?
Breitling watch, yeah, whatever. Mm-hmm.
Maybe, but don't you say that there are demons on that plane. Don't you say it.
All I'm saying is, like, I totally get that. We had a pastor at a church when I grew up. They were, you got to take care of your pastors, and you got to take care of your church. You're a part of a community. And I guess he bought his son a nice car. And it was like an Oldsmobile though. And like, they gave him the hardest time about that. And like, to the point he had to leave the church. Like, they thought it was too nice of a car for his son to drive. And I was like, man, I think that there's like a line, there's a certain line, like let pastors who are bivocational, or pastors who write books, or pastors who adjunct professor or do something behind the scenes. That's fine. As long as they're leading their flock and they're preaching the gospel, and their message outside of the church is still gospel oriented. Like, if you're going to do a podcast on the gospel if you're a pastor. So, and it's okay to have separate incomes coming in. Like, they got to live. I get it 100%. I don't expect my pastor to live in a 1,200 square foot house with 6 kids and one big van that's 12 years old, Well,
and I think it's okay for us to honor our pastors. And so I remember when Joby was here, I mean, we really as a group rolled out the red carpet for him whenever he was here, because he was staying here with us and he was, doing content with us. And he even mentioned afterwards, he's like, where it talks about outdoing one another in honor. It's like, I feel like guys miss that sometimes because we're like, just throw the guy, a bag of Cheetos and, give him a beer and he'll be okay. Technically true, but also it is okay to go out of your way to honor people sometimes. Like, whenever I came up to you after the sermon, like I wanted you to really understand that landed with me. Not that you needed that from me. You didn't need me to tell you that, but I felt like this is an honorable thing to do for me to not just have that nice thought disappear. And the same thing is true where, you have these things online like Preachers in Sneakers, where they always look at some of these megachurch pastors and it's like, he's wearing, $1,000 Gucci belt and he's wearing, a $10,000 pair of Jordans and all that type of stuff. The thing is what I never see on those sites is the pastor in a suit and tie that's wearing $1,000 custom made Italian shoes, and the suit costs $3,000 and all that. But we don't do that because it's not, off-white, Jordans or something like that, or I don't even know if I made the reference right. And so it's like, I know it makes people feel uncomfortable, but there are certain things that I won't do. Like I have a pair of Jordans that I would like to wear whenever I go and speak, but I don't even focused on my shoes. That's why I wear all black. I wear a black V-neck, black boots, and black jeans because I want them to be not distracted by anything that I'm wearing. But what if the boots were handmade by some cobbler in the middle of nowhere and it cost me $5,000? Does that mean that I'm not qualified to speak? Does it mean I'm more qualified to speak? And I feel like people get really, really wrapped around the axle with that. It's like, yes, if you're stealing from the congregants, if you're stealing from your flock, if you're convincing them to give you money to their detriment, yeah, that's obviously a big issue, and you're going to have to give an account someday for what you've done. But, if pastors make money because their book becomes a mega bestseller, who cares?
I mean, I get that, but it's also, what's the heart behind it? And you kind of brought it up. Are they doing this just to make money?
Yeah, I believe. Yeah, of course.
If we come back, we'll go over in Acts 20 where Paul talks to the elders and he goes over I never took anything from you guys. Yeah. I never outstayed my welcome. But that's the thing. It's you can't put your livelihood on the backs of your congregation, but you also need to, if you're preaching the gospel and you're doing the job of a shepherd, you're going to be honored for that. And if you're honored for it and you're honored by it with a Breitling watch, I guess, by all means, that's great. But I remember a guy I saw a pastor, I can't remember where it was from, but he chastised his congregation because he asked for this watch and nobody went out and gave enough money for him to get this watch. I saw it. Yeah. Boy. It is just some other pastors are like, hey, I want us to give more money because I need this private jet. You can fly commercial, bro.
Well, the thing is I think it's okay to lavish on people because there are people that have been blessed by God and they have a lot of means. And so I'm thinking of a personal example. So Matt Chicken there, when he was hanging out here, he's like, one day, Tony Romo, who's a friend of his, he just flies my wife and I on a private jet to come and hang out with him at this resort with some other people. And, we were doing some Bible study and discipleship type stuff. But he's like, what if I had posted a picture of my wife and I, sipping on Cristal or something like that, and on this private plane or all that? It's well, if you're doing that to show honor to somebody that has lavished honor upon you, that's one thing. But what if he's like, look how dope my life is. Yeah. Don't you feel sad that your life sucks this bad? Because mine doesn't suck at all. And so I do think the motivation matters, but I feel like pastors are almost trying to they want you to see they're driving a Corolla because they're like, look, I'm not driving around in a Bentley. I'm better than these other pastors. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. What's that called? I can't think of the word.
It'll come to you. It'll come to you. But go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, when I pastored a more rural church, most of my constituents, or at least the longstanding members, were farmers.
Yep.
And also at this church, in terms of the church budget, the church budget was published in a way that the personnel budget was line itemed. You could see what every pastor made, what their health insurance costs were. Every dime that went to the pastor was public knowledge amongst the whole church. And I think everybody wanted the pastor to be paid well. They just didn't want the pastor to be paid more than them.
Okay.
That might cause some problems.
And one of the dynamics at play there was you had all these blue collar farmer type guys that worked really hard.
Yeah.
They worked hard, and they didn't see Bible study and counseling and prayer and leading meetings as hard work.
Yeah.
And so there was this disconnect between maybe what the compensation was and the kind of work that the pastor was doing. And so you had to kind of get in and rewire some things and help them understand, okay, yeah, I'm not doing hard work in the way that baling hay or plowing a field or, working and branding cattle all day is hard work, but I'm doing heart work.
Yeah.
And sometimes heart work is harder than hard work. It takes a deeper and more enduring toll on your life than just the hard work.
So with that in mind, what do you and Mark make? If you just want to tell all of us,
is that in the budget? Can we look at that?
Yeah. Can you?
If you want to go to the treasurer and ask, he will show it to you.
Okay. Very good.
I think it's good though. I think it's good for churches because I went to a church that had no elder board or anything. We had no idea where the money was going. Like we've asked, hey, we're giving to all these organizations. How much money are we giving to these organizations? And the pastor would not show us.
Well, there are some traditions that are still alive today that the pastor is king. He makes the budget. He allocates the funds. He sets his own salary. And those are really dangerous places.
Yeah. The word I was thinking was virtue signaling.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Like driving that Corolla, you're like virtue signaling. Like,
well, and it's almost like some people will try to virtue signal on both sides by doing the epic life stuff and doing the no, I'm a pauper just like you type of thing. Now we have to be disciplined about this. I want to spend a maximum of 5 minutes on this because we've still got good stuff to even talk about in this section. And at some point we've all got to eat food. You kind of alluded to this a little bit, and you and I have talked about this before. When pastors in their, I guess you could call it off time, they will do things that are not explicitly ministry related or gospel. So perhaps you're a big megachurch pastor and you have a leadership podcast. The problem is we're not naming any names, Craig Rochelle, but maybe you've got a leadership podcast and you're helping people because you are, more leader than you are pastor or something like that. But you're using church time and church funds to build out a studio. You're using the staff people that are paid for the church to do something that is serving a leadership purpose. Now, I can see both sides. Maybe you are a church staff member and you have a leadership deficit in your personality or in your staff. And you're like, let's learn from somebody that is kind of more on this leadership guru side. And maybe that'll help us run our ministry better. I can see that side, but I can also see the people that are like, wait a minute, you're using church time and funds to do something that is not bringing anyone closer to the gospel or really helping people directly in ministry. I can see both sides. I personally land on one side of the ledger over the other. You can take a wild guess where you think I land, but it's one of those things where I think it's a fair critique, but I don't know how far to take that to where it's like, look, you are a pastor. You can't give any advice that's outside the Bible or outside of any type of pastoral ministry. So just curious where you guys think about that. But yeah, keep your comments cogent because we got a lot more to cover.
I don't have a problem with it. I'm actually okay with it to a point. It's just if we want to use Craig Rochelle as an example, it's his leadership podcast. I don't think Life Church has the best model for discipleship or for,
or any model
at all. Really. It just reminds me of let's open as bunch of mini malls as we can and then get people in there. And then, it's just very seeker sensitive. And so I don't feel like there's a shepherding model to it. So would I look at Craig Rochelle is somebody who I want to hear a shepherding podcast on? Probably not. But when it comes to organizational leadership, he's doing what he's got to do.
Yeah, right.
And I get that. That's fine. So I don't judge him for it. I just wish you'd bring up the gospel more.
And I just would say that you've got to keep the main thing. I go to a job. I have a primary job that I go to, and that is what I'm getting paid to do. And so I spend my time and effort and energy and all that towards that. Now, as soon as I quote unquote clock out, then I can do whatever I want after that. But I don't know the ins and outs on this whole thing with Life Church, whatnot. But if it starts to bleed into now I'm taking calls during my work hours for this other thing that I'm doing, then I think it becomes a problem, right? I mean, it makes sense from just a basic employment standpoint. So keep the main thing, and then whatever you're going to do after that. I don't have a problem with that personally. I don't know. What's your thought?
Yeah, I had a church called me a while back, and they it was some elders at the church, and they were asking me, what are your policies about your pastoral staff, primarily your senior pastor, being gone? Oh, we don't really have that. We kind of just feel our way through that. And their issue was they had a senior pastor who was being gone too much on mission trips. And so, I mean, that's obviously a noble, important thing to be doing. And this man felt called into it. But they were trying to figure out, okay, he needs to be here. We're paying him to be here preaching. But he's always kind of got on the docket the next big trip that he's going to go on and help facilitate church planting or help church leaders in developing countries or where they might be doing mission work. So, that's a tough one. Yeah. Like that's good work. Like that needs, he's feel called to it, needs to be done. So they just need to have that hard conversation to get at the balance that the church needs to find. So
sounds like he's an evangelist.
Seems like it. Yeah.
And that's the thing is making sure, I mean, this goes back to the Jim Collins good to great stuff. It's not just making sure you're on the right bus. It's making sure you're on the right seat on the right bus. Mm-hmm. But then if you're a pastor, you can't have a board of directors. You have to have a board of elders, right? So that's the other difference with some of these mega church guys is like they are the chairman of the board, like, and they don't have elders that can really check them. They're kind of insulated from a lot of that. And so if you're kind of using that Jim Collins model, everyone's got to agree on the direction that the bus is going while they're sitting in the correct seat. And so again, I'm all for leadership. Look, on our 100 books every modern Christian man should read list, we have a leadership and business section. That's how important we think this stuff is. But perhaps the context, timing, and who pays for it really matters. One thing that I wanted to point out is, and I make this point a lot, that if you just read the Bible and then this happened and then he said this and then whatever, and you read no personality into it, you could miss some stuff. So I missed entirely how hilarious verse 7 is. Because here he is, he's talking to the Jews, they're kind of rejecting him. At some point he realizes it's pearls before swine. And, he's got to be really angry when he says, your blood be on your own heads, I am innocent. From now on, I will go with the Gentiles. And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. And I was just like, holy cow, how many times have I read that section and not thought about how exactly hilarious that is? He has that declarative moment. He is screaming. He is red-faced. He's got veins popping out of his forehead. And he goes next door. He's like, watch this. Like, I don't know if y'all maybe got that the first time, but it completely missed me how funny that was until I read it last.
I didn't see the humor until just now.
Isn't that ridiculous? Yeah. Like I'm going next. I'm so mad. I'm going next door.
That's like you get mad at your wife and you're like, I'm out of here. And you just like walk to the other room.
Isn't that how it normally goes though?
I mean,
that's how it's gone for me before. But that's another thing. It's like
true.
You've got to make sure that whenever you're reading this, that you're not, missing out on some of this important context and things like that. But I did actually have a question, and so Jay or whoever can maybe shed some light on this. So you have this section towards the end of what we just read, starting in verse 9. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. For I have many in this city who are my people." I've read two different reads of this section. The first is kind of more of a Calvinist read, and another is not. So the Calvinist read is like, look, my elect are in this city. I need you to be bold. I need you to stay there, okay? Because I've got more people that I need to go get, right? The other read I've gotten is like, hey, don't worry about being harmed. I got people in this city. It's kind of like, I'm from Lawton. If you know anything about Oklahoma, Lawton can be a rough city if you don't know the right people. And so if someone's going in and they're a guest and you're basically saying, hey, don't worry about it. I got you. I got people in Lawton. I think back to Braveheart when the guy's like, talking about the people in Ireland. He's like, basically, these are my people. Like, it's mine. Like that's his island. That's his island or something like that. So I don't know which way to read that text because I've heard the arguments both ways. And depending upon the translation you read, it seems clear one way or the other. Thoughts?
Y'all looking at me for election, huh? If I have to remember, and when we discussed this with Pastor Mark, he did bring up election in regards to this portion.
Yeah,
right.
I've never read it or even heard of the interpretation that Paul would say, I got
boys in this
hood. Or that God would say, I got people here that are going to take care of you. But that's interesting. But I've always read it the other way.
So do we assume he's dealing with some fear? I mean, is that why it's being addressed? Because like in the past,
I think he's just discouraged. I think he's discouraged. He's like, I'm trying to preach to these people. They're not listening. They're creating problems. And like, why am I here? And he's like, don't give up. I've got people in here that need to hear this. So that's how I
it's
look
like
at
everywhere he goes, he's like, all right, I got this window of opportunity. I'm going to preach, say a few things, few days, maybe a few weeks or whatever. But eventually these guys are going to come from, these Jews are coming in and they're just going to disrupt this.
There's that. And like when you look at his journeys beforehand, he's like staying with people. He's got a place to stay. He's probably being taken care of by a certain church in there. But here in Corinth, he's a tent maker. He's making a tent. He's trying to get by. And so, and the times that he's trying to get by and make a living, he's also in his downtime trying to preach the gospel and people aren't listening. And so I bet a lot of discouragement's coming in through that.
So I would say the first time that I saw it where I was like, okay, this isn't like an election thing. So I was listening. So part of the way that I study is I'll do all my study, but then towards the end, I will just listen to Johnny Cash reading the New Testament. And so Johnny Cash is reading the New Testament, the New King James Version. So here's how the New King James Version talks about this section. So starting in verse 9, now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. Do not be afraid, but speak and do not keep silent. For I am with you and no one will attack you or hurt you, for I have many people in this city. That's how it's said. And so that seems fairly declarative that it's like, hey, no one's going to hurt you because I got people there, right? And so then it was like, oh, shoot. Like, is this not like, hey, you got to stay there because I got to get more people? Or it's like, hey, man, you're going to be fine, like physically, don't worry about it. Like, don't be afraid, be bold. So that was kind of the first time that I looked at it there. Now, okay, let's actually go ahead and move on. Let's kind of keep moving through Acts 18. Or go ahead.
I'll just say, though, that the way I've looked at that and read that and used that, applied it, has just been in relation to missionary confidence. So if a missionary feels called to go to a place, they can go with that knowledge that God has called them and is sending them somewhere because there are people there. So it's not left to them to be, the truth's not contingent upon their presentation. The truth's not contingent upon even their preparation. The truth is based on the fact that God has people. He is the elect of God, that he is sending messengers to share the gospel with, who he's going to call and draw to himself. So, just a little cherry on top there.
I wonder how long, missionaries go to, I just have this thought of like, okay, I feel called to this area. I go and there's literally nothing that happens for the first 5 years or whatever, or 3 years or whatever. Like what, I assume there's dealing with discouragement in that period of time. Like, do missionaries give up and just move out? Do they? I guess it's a personal thing, but like, it seemed like I would struggle a little bit if I literally was in a place forever and I felt like I just continued to quote unquote plant seeds, but I was not seeing any fruit come from that. I'm kind of thinking of a friend who has a brother that went to a place and it just was a disaster. And I don't know the full situation. I don't know if they just said, hey, this would be a cool place to go. We should just go. And then it just ended up that way. But anyways, I think personally, when I think about it, if I went somewhere and was not seeing any fruit, I think that would be personally hard for me.
Yeah, the reason that I don't necessarily think it's probably discouragement here is because the Lord, when he's communicating to Paul, he says, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. And so my assumption would be that maybe he was a little gun shy. Now, was he gun shy because he was so discouraged because he had so much failure or, wasn't really gaining traction? We can't exactly know, but we're going to keep moving on Acts 18. But I did want to remind you guys that we are partnered with Crossway and with Logos. So Logos, let's start there. The best and most powerful Bible software. Browning has it up on his computer right now. Guys, if you're wanting to get a much deeper dive into your personal Bible study or your group Bible study, you can't do any better than the Logos Bible software. It is absolutely robust. So guys, if you're going to use it, don't use it at full price. Use it as a discount. We do have a discount code there in the show notes. And then also Crossway, shout out. They've got amazing books, including this amazing journal set that you can get everything. So you can bleed ink all over the Bible if you feel the need to, but they have a 5-book forging table starter set. So guys, if you want to get these 5 books, but you don't want to pay full price, you can get all 5 of these books at 50% off. There's a great study Bible. There's some other really, really good resources in there. A book from Vodi Bakum. So shout out, get into that. So let's go backwards. Jay, if you can read verses 12 through 17.
But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. What am I reading through, by the way?
You're going through 17.
Okay. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about words and names in your own law, look after it yourselves. I'm unwilling to be a judge of these matters. And he drove them away from the judgment seat. And they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. But Gallio was not concerned about any of these things.
And so the interesting thing about this section is the guy's kind of like, why are you complaining to me? Exactly. Like he was fairly kind of dismissive of this, but even though he was dismissive, it was really important here because his refusal to really take this complaint seriously, this essentially gave Paul free reign to minister and evangelize in these Roman provinces, and that he would be protected by Roman law, because it's kind of like they shot their shot here at the beginning and the guy just didn't really take the bait. And so that's what I feel like is important here in this section. Is there anything else on there before we go to Paul returning to Antioch?
Yeah, is that just kind of like almost like a evidence of a church and a separation of church and state in that moment? I mean, can we look at it that way, or is that unfair?
No, I think that's a good parallel. Like these are ecclesiastical matters.
Yeah.
We don't use that terminology in the law court. You guys settle this yourselves.
When it gets back to the reason that Thomas Jefferson even put that in his letter, because again, the separation of church and state, that you can't find that anywhere in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Independence. That was in a personal letter to a small group of people in a part of the United States. And his point was not so that we could keep the church out of the state, it's so that we could keep the state out of the church. And so that's the thing that everyone gets wrong about that, including people that are, pro-God, pro-Christianity, and, anti the government infiltration, is it's keeping the government out of meddling within the church. And so I think that is a good corollary there, because he's just like, yeah, this doesn't have anything to do with us. Like it was almost like how Pilate at the beginning of this whole thing with going on with Jesus, he was like, please don't make me have to intercede in all this. Like, please don't make me have to get into all this. But the Jews were very adamant about it. And obviously we kind of know how the story ends there. Let's go ahead and get into Paul returning to Antioch. So Ryan, if you will hit 18 through 23, please.
Yep. After this, Paul stayed many days longer, then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. At
That's a hard one.
Centurea?
Something like that.
Looks good. That should be like a name of a pop star.
He had cut his hair, for he was under vow, and they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. But he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked for him to stay for a longer period, he declined. But on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus. When he had landed in Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time there, he departed and went from one place to the next through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples.
So, quick section here, but I did actually have a question came up with verse 20. When they asked him to stay for a long period, he declined. Do we know why? Do we have any guesses as to why? Because
I know he's been wanting to go back to Jerusalem.
Yeah, I'm right. And so again, he says in the next verse, like, I will return to you if God wills. And so it's like, I feel like there's a lot of ways to read that, like why he didn't stay, but I didn't get any compelling answers. Anything?
I mean, maybe he had done what he had planned on doing, or maybe he had people that he could, employ to continue the work, so to speak. And he's like, I need to keep moving. You've got the right people in.
Yeah, that's what happened in Berea. I mean, Timothy and Silas stayed.
I mean, Paul was a pioneer. I mean, that's the kind of work he did. And so if things could sustain themselves without him, if leaders were there, if people were prepared, it was his heart to move on. Like, let's keep pressing the gospel forward. So it's not surprising that he would want to leave.
One thing that came up for me was the Nazirite vow.
Yeah.
It sounds like there was a Nazirite vow taken. And why did he take a Nazirite vow?
No idea.
No idea. Because it's like, why would they put that in there? Because it's like, you can tell it's a Nazirite vow.
It's almost like a throwaway line, but
I'm like, that's a Nazirite vow. If you look at it, like, why would he have taken that vow? Sorry.
It's an important question. I don't know how to.
I couldn't find anything on it. That's why I was like, I'm going to ask the pastor.
I don't know. It is an interesting little feature, and it might be just related to, we all have these like little seasons of, okay, I need to get disciplined about X or Y, so I'm going to do this. So I mean,
could it was like a fasting type thing?
Yeah,
because you don't drink any wine. You can't have anything from the vine.
Can't touch anything dead.
You can't be around anything dead. Yeah. So
okay, so this actually kind of relates to something that came up. I think it was a couple of years ago now, but Mark did a sermon and he talked quite a bit about alcohol. Now, I wasn't happy with how he did it. He pulled the swerve out at the end. He was like, oh yeah, here's all these different ways you can do it, but I don't drink. And he basically looked at everybody in the crowd and was like, and if you do, you're going to hell. He didn't say that, but it was heavily implied that everyone would go to hell if they drink.
That sermon, I ran into our worship pastor at Torchy's and I was like, hey, you getting the beers?
Oh, what
Joel was like, I don't even know who you are. You were at church, weren't you?
Yeah. So is it something like that to where he's almost like, hey, I'm going to take this vow. Like, hey, I'll be straight edge for a while. Like, I'm not going to touch any of these things. Maybe he was worried about leaning too far into one of those because we all kind of know our dispositions. Like one of the great bits of advice that Joby gave me in terms of accountability, he has told all of his elders, if Satan were going to take me out, here are the categories. So here are the questions that you need to ask me. Like whenever we're doing any type of accountability, here are the things that you need to ask me about. Because some people have a chemical bend. They can't just have one beer without having a dozen. And then there are other people that it's more like it's the lust of the eyes. Like they can't keep from, looking at women that aren't their wife or fantasizing or any of those types of things. Like we all kind of have our different flavors. So I'm wondering, like, maybe did Paul know something about himself? Maybe it's like, look, this wine stuff, I could get out of control pretty quick. So let me just take this vow so I can almost like take it off the table.
Yeah, I mean, there's always this mystery about what the thorn in the flesh is and these different things that Paul battled. So Paul was not immune to suffering. He wasn't immune to, I'm sure, temptation or all the things that we deal with on a daily basis either. So for him to discipline his body as much as he even preaches about it, writes about it, we have an example of him doing it right here.
I like to think of the fasting. I think that brings up really a good thought. Like maybe like taking that Nazirite vow, it's like, hey, I'm going to fast from this stuff.
Maybe he's like, one of these days, Ryan Horn is going to read this and I want him to feel okay about being bald. And he's just kind of like, I'm just going to cut my hair and say, because there's virtue in that, right?
I felt great about it.
You've been aerodynamic for a very long time.
Slap a pair of Speedos on me and call me Bullet.
Now, we didn't need to know that, and we definitely didn't need that image, so I'm going to try to move on as quickly as possible without throwing up in my mouth. So, hey, let's wrap up Acts 18. So, Jay, if you will read 24 through the end, which is verse 28.
Now a Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, came to Ephesus, and he was mighty in the Scriptures. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus. But being acquainted only with the baptism of John, and he began to speak out boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wanted to go across to Achaia, the brethren encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. And when he had arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace. For he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, demonstrating by the Scriptures that Jesus was the Christ.
So the thing that stood out to me with this section is in this moment, this dude had all kinds of passion, but it was misdirected. And so it seemed like Priscilla and Aquila, they were like what a good mom and dad would do. It's like, look, son, I love your passion. Let me kind of help you let's direct that passion a little bit as opposed to just, hey, let's be a wild Mustang because, wild Mustangs are good. Let's not bridle this horse, right? Let's not bridle this Mustang. Let's just maybe point you in a direction that's better. And so I thought that this was a really good example of them just, hey, not trying to embarrass him publicly, but like, hey, let's keep the passion, but let's just make the message better.
But I also liked it in the fact, if you look at Apollos, he actually sat and listened. He wasn't like, he wasn't like, oh, I know everything. And like, who are you two people? I don't know who you are. But like, once we stop wanting to learn and once we stop learning to listen, like that's a problem. And I think that him keeping that open mind and listening to them and then them being able to show him scripturally, cause like it says back towards the end that showing by scriptures that the Christ was Jesus, it's like, all right, they showed him through scriptures and corrected him through scripture. And like, he was open to that and was like, all right, I need to learn this. This is what it is. And he accepted it and moved on and was able to give the right presentation of the gospel, through that. So It's like, always be open.
Yeah. When I think about someone that's a disciple of Christ, I think about one of the key features is being able to receive someone's rebuke and not get all offended and touchy and prideful about it, but be able to receive it and then be willing to change, be willing to consider what they've said. I know this isn't a rebuke necessarily. He just didn't know. I mean, it's just like, he'd been doing what he thought was right. And they're just like, hey, stuff has happened and we want to get you up to speed and up to date. But I agree with you. I like how it appears that he received that and then just was like, all right, let's do this. This is great.
Because it might have felt like a rebuke. It certainly may have felt like it in the moment, but he responds well.
One of the things that we need to look at in here that we're going to see in the next chapters, and it just literally popped out of me. It said, and being fervent in the spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. Mm-hmm. So we're going to go into some other chapters, and this might give it away, but if he was baptized and he was learning during John the Baptist. And so he wasn't filled with the Holy Spirit or knew what happened after Christ and saying, hey, we talk about repenting, believing, but this has already come to pass. That there is a new law through Christ. And so he only knew everything before Christ, and now he's learning everything after Christ.
Yeah, it seemed very genuine and honest, right? It wasn't like he was trying to lead people astray. This is just, he just needed to learn.
He just had an old message.
Yeah.
And it's a really fascinating little window into this period of time. The birth of the church, just the worldviews that are swirling, the message of Jesus, the forerunner John, just apostleship, like a Priscilla and Aquila, they weren't apostles.
No.
But they were these well-trained laymen, closely acquainted with Paul, that could come alongside this guy and just coach him up, guide him, teach him, fill out whatever knowledge he had so that he could then go forward in ministry.
Could you say they were like disciples? Because like we're all kind of disciples. Like if we're going out and preaching the gospel, we're discipling. So like they were just good disciples.
Good disciples.
Good disciples.
We don't have any indication from the text that Apollos was welcoming rebuke, that he had told, Priscilla and Aquila, like, hey, if I ever get led astray, will you kind of like give me some feedback? And so good on Apollos for accepting this feedback, good on Priscilla and Aquila for giving the feedback, but also every opportunity I can get to make this point, I will. If you do what we tell you to do through the Undaunted.Life ministry, and if you get guys in your life, foxhole guys, 3 a.m. guys that'll help you bury your dog, however you want to frame it, and you say, guys, you can disciple me and you can also hold me accountable. And if the first time they do that, you reject it, you fall back into your ego and you say, you don't know what you're talking about and you don't have the full context and blah, blah, and all that. That is a massive issue because most guys are not going to go back to that well. They're going to be like, oh, this guy is not really trustworthy. He's not really going to accept this. I think about what Jordan Peterson talked about whenever you work on these construction crews. One of the first things construction crews will do with a new guy is they'll kind of razz him a little bit to see if he can handle the razzing, if he can take a joke. Because if the guy gets too sensitive and can't take a joke, it's like, this man, I don't know if I can trust this guy in the fire because he's getting all, bent out of shape over a little bitty joke. But also the good thing about what Apollos does here at the end, he says, when he arrived, he greatly helped those who through grace had believed, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. There is something very, very important about public and forceful refutation. That is a good thing in the right context, because there are people that are default aggressive. They are a hammer and the entire world is a nail. That's problematic. Then you have people that they've never found a hill that was worth dying on, and they're fine with, leaving some powder for tomorrow's battle, even though tomorrow's battle may never come. But this is a great example of he's pushing back darkness where it needs to be pushed back. He's boldly doing that. And this idea that Christians should only be winsome, they should never ruffle any feathers, and there's no context for that. This is just another example that actually, yes, there are times where refutation, full-throated refutation, is positive.
Yeah, and interesting. I have no idea if this is meaningful or not, but when he was talking about cutting his hair and being under a Nazirite vow, it's just kind of that throwaway verse. We know that he talks about, I think it's in Corinthians, about like, we have the freedom to, if we feel convicted by this or that, we can do that, but we don't necessarily have to put that on other people. Like, you have to do this in order to be saved or make God more pleased or whatever. So, so he has that in there, but it doesn't say, and he cut his hair for his under a vow and then went and taught everybody they also needed to do this in order to be more right with Jesus. It doesn't say that. But what I see down here is this whole like getting, Apollos kind of on board. That also is not, hey, we do full submersion baptism versus sprinkling baptism. You need to get on the right page with this. It wasn't all these like sidebar issues. It was just on the issue of the gospel and a more right presentation of what Jesus has done and how these brothers or these future brothers can be filled with the Holy Spirit through salvation, blah, blah, blah.
I was just thinking, like, when you talked about that he powerfully refuted, like he caused division. Like if we look back at the last, couple even last chapter and this chapter, there's always division with what Paul said or somebody said. Like, I mean, there was riots going on. So it wasn't like somebody came in there winsomely and was just like, hey man, I just want to let you guys all know. Like, no, people were getting upset.
If it's okay with you, could I potentially make you mad?
And it's like, hey, no matter where you go, you're going to have people that are going to believe and they're going to see what you're saying, or they're going to be angry, And so you can't just say like, my job is not to make people angry. I don't think Paul or Apollos is going in there to make people angry, but people are going to get angry whether you're nice about it or not.
And let the message make people angry, not the way you're delivering it.
Give
like
it the full,
that's another good thing.
Give the full message, but give it in grace and truth.
Right. Jay, give us the last word here on Acts 18.
I like to take the end of 27 and the first part of 28, even as a complimentary statement. So he greatly helped those who had believed through grace, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public. That idea of grace set up against law, I think that the word, that's not a throwaway word, that he was helping those who believe through grace, because he was helping them see that it's not through the works of the law that they're saved. They're saved by grace through the finished work of Christ.
Absolutely. All right, guys, there's more that could be said about Acts 18, but we're going to leave it there. Come back here next week. We are going to be digging into Acts 19. But before we do, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. Don't forget about the Crossway Forging Table Starter Set. Don't forget about the Logos Bible software. And also don't forget, we are a donation-based ministry. If you want to see more content like this to equip men around the globe to push back darkness, please hop on board and be a donor. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. That's info@Undaunted.Life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.Undaunted.Life. And as always, we want to thank the band Holy Name for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is their song Perpetua, which is off their self-titled debut album on Face Down Records. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.